The CCP Plenary is the meetings of the top Chinese Communist Party's leaders. In particular, the meeting that we're really interested in is a third plenary meeting. This happens about 1 year after the new leadership comes into power. China's leadership now has a 10-year term structure, so it happens once every 10 years. So it happens about a year after the new leadership comes in to power. The first two plenaries are deciding personnel issues. The third plenary focuses on the policy agenda for the next 10 years. So that's why this is particularly important, because this is basically a platform for the new Chinese leaders to set out the policy agenda, and during the reform era particularly, the reform agenda for the next 10 years. The plenary role is more setting goals and objectives and basic principles, guiding the development strategy for the next 10 years. The 5-year plan is more specific action items, if you will, on how to execute these plans and meeting these objectives. China faces two important challenges now. One is that after 30+ years of very rapid economic development, China has reached mid-income level status. So usually what happens for countries reaching that status is that economic growth will slow down as a natural result of development. And secondly, the major reforms that China has implemented has all sort of become a spent force, and that have become outdated for China's current economic status. So to continue the very rapid economic development, China really needs new reforms to help boost growth. One challenge the new leadership faces in pushing through new reforms is that in the beginning of the reform era, opposition within the Chinese Communist Party to reform basically come from an ideological standpoint. So you have hardline factions in the party opposing reform. Right now, you don't really have that anymore. So the opposition mainly comes from the vested interest within the party. And the issue is that after 30+ years of very rapid economic growth, the pie has grown very, very large. So the vested interests are very vast and very deeply entrenched and very powerful as a result. So one example of China continuing to maintain high productivity growth is the need to reform the financial sector. And the reason is that China, as we all know, China has very high savings rate. Now to channel those vast savings into investment opportunities, you really need a mechanism to be very efficient by moving the savings, the monies that's saved, into the most highly productive investment opportunities. Because China's financial sector is completely controlled by the government, so that transition mechanism is not very efficient. Savings are not always allocated to the most highly productive investment opportunities. It could be very wasteful. And the challenge now is that because you have the financial sector being controlled mostly by the government, so the vested interest in that sector does not want to let that go. And the pie in the financial sector is incredibly large. So it's very challenging for the government to come in and try to dismantle this system. So that's the challenge that China faces. I think one major theme is that the leadership has indicated that they want to let market forces to play a decisive factor in allocating resources. So that's very important, and that's very encouraging. The other not so encouraging theme is that the leadership wanted to make sure that the state-owned sector play a primary role in the economy going forward. Although they also said that other forms of ownership will also play a key role in the economy. But that shows you the current system in China, that to completely let go the state-owned sector model of development is still not possible. Another key theme is that the leadership wanted to level the playing field. They want to reduce monopolistic powers in certain sectors, although they did not specify which sectors those are. They also want to make sure. They also indicated that one of the means that they will achieve that is through price reform. A major theme coming out of the third plenary meeting is that the government indicated that they will maintain a gradualist approach to economic reform. This has been their approach for the last 30 plus years. The reason is that the government wants to make sure that while they push through economic reform, they also want to maintain stability. Another important theme coming out of the meeting is addressing the rural-urban divide. The government is trying to address this by taking two approaches. One is to afford the farmers more property rights so that they have a stake in the economic development. On the urban front, the government is trying to encourage more urbanization. And a key element of this is the dismantling of the residential registration system, the so-called hukou system. A key reason the government wants to encourage urbanization is to drive consumer spending. So China has an issue of being very imbalanced. So economic growth has depended too much on exports and investment and not so much on consumer spending. So the government's hope is that by driving urbanization, the urban consumers could take up the burden more. The outcome of the reform of the third plenary meeting, in my view, I think in the final analysis will be successful. I think the government, at the end of the day, will take bold actions to address some of these areas that really desperately need reform. And the reason I say that is that if you look at Chinese government's track record since reform began, whenever their economic development reached a bottleneck, they were always very willing to take very bold actions. So one example is that in 1998, when they already set forth the reform agenda from the 93 third plenary meeting, and the one key element of that reform agenda is to reform the industrial state-owned sector. And the consequence of that was to lay off a lot of people because they were going to privatize a lot of the small industrial enterprises. But in '98, we know that that was the year when Asian crisis was at its height. So that had tremendous impact, negative impact on Chinese economy. But the Chinese government still went ahead and with that reform. In 1998, they laid off close to 20 million people. So that was a very bold move because in a very negative business environment, as we all know, how much emphasis Chinese government places on stability. But they knew that if they didn't do that, they didn't reform the state-owned sector, the long-term prospects of their development program will be in jeopardy. So they still went ahead and pushed through that reform. So that's why I'm cautiously optimistic. It's very clear that China's economic development has reached a bottleneck. It's clear to outside observers. It's clear to government leaders. So I think they will do something, and they will do something substantive. The difference between now and 1998 is that the vested interests now have even more to lose. But I think the underlying issue remains the same. And I think the government's approach to push through these reforms remain the same. Because they set out these very broad goals. And so they leave enough room for them to iron out the details on what kind of reform they will push through. Also, during this whole process, they will try to bring a consensus among the vested interest to get their buy-in. Obviously, there will be compromises made, but I think at the end of the day, the consensus that they will reach, with the vested interest is that although the pie right now is very big, but if we don't push through these reforms, the pie will remain the same size. It will not grow. And given China's political system, a very stagnant economic growth environment does not bode well for social stability. So I think in that sense, it's easier at the end of the day to create buy-in among the vested interest. In terms of environmental protection, it's important this time because China also has emphasis not only on the quantity of growth, but also the quality of growth. But in my assessment that achievement of environmental protection and the quality of environment will remain a long-term struggle. Because we have heard similar language from the previous leadership, although the same phrase did not make it to the previous document, in the document of the previous third plenum. But the emphasis on protecting the environment, was touted by the WHO and WIN government as well. But in reality, in terms of what they actually executed, was very limited. And the issue is that there's a conflict between still the need to promote economic growth versus the quality of the environment, the quality of that growth. One important detail from the third plenum decision document on the environment is that the government will hold the local officials not only responsible for economic growth, but meeting environmental goals as well. But the thing is, we'll have to wait and see whether or not, to what extent this will be implemented. Like I mentioned, the main goal for most officials is still, especially local officials, is still to develop their local economies.